Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're immersing ourselves in some really fascinating source material.
Yeah, we're looking at the Wikipedia biographical archives of a woman who well, she defies almost every historical and spiritual category you could try to put her in.
Right. Her full name is Maria Concepción Cabrera Arias de Armida.
So she's far better known to history and to the millions who follow her spiritual lineage today simply as Conchita.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start. What's the mission for our deep dive today?
Well, the mission is to unpack a really profound historical paradox. We are examining how a laywoman, a busy mother, a grieving widow, a citizen living through one of the most devastating conflicts of the early 20th century.
The Mexican Revolution.
Exactly. How did she manage to cultivate an interior life so intensely deep that she's now officially recognized as a beatified mystic by the Catholic Church?
It's the intersection of extreme, gritty, everyday reality and just towering mystical theology.
Yeah, and the archives give us a specific metric that immediately reframes how we have to look at her.
The page count.
A page count.
I mean, this is a woman raising 9 children in a bustling household, and she wrote over 60,000 handwritten pages of religious and theological reflections.
It's staggering.
Just to put that into a historical perspective for you listening, that volume of complex theological writing rivals the lifetime output of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right, and Aquinas was a friar. His literal full-time vocation was to sit in quiet rooms, study, and write the foundational texts of Western theology.
And Conchita was changing diapers. She was managing a massive household and trying to keep her family alive during a literal war.
It forces a complete recalibration of our assumptions, doesn't it?
Totally.
When we hear the word mystic, the cultural imagination immediately conjures up an isolated hermit in a cave.
Or a cloistered monk with a vow of silence.
Right, completely detached from the material concerns of the world. But Conchita obliterates that stereotype. The archival materials make it abundantly clear she was deeply, inextricably embedded in the loud, messy reality of family life.
She wasn't a mystic who escaped the world. She plunged directly into the center of it.
I think that's the perfect place to start. Let's look at the early life of this everyday mystic.
The historical record shows she was born on December 8, 1862,
In San Luis Potosi, Mexico.
to Octaviano Cabrera Lacavex and Clara Arias Rivera. And what we know about her upbringing paints a picture of a respectable, somewhat standard middle-class reality for that era.
She wasn't born into abject poverty, but she certainly wasn't shielded by aristocratic royalty either.
And amidst that standard upbringing, there's this wonderfully humanizing detail preserved in her own recollections.
Oh, I love this part.
She openly remembered being a frequently disobedient child.
I have to admit, that detail is incredibly refreshing.
Isn't it? So often, biographical accounts of beatified figures or saints are just retroactively sanitized.
They try to paint them as entirely flawless from birth.
Right, like infants who supposedly never cried and toddlers who spent all day in silent prayer.
But Conchita herself shattered that illusion. She admitted she was a difficult, unruly kid.
It instantly bridges the gap between her and the reader.
It does. It establishes a narrative of genuine human development. But right alongside that childhood unruliness, the biographical texts point out an unusual, intense devotion to the Holy Eucharist from a very young age.
So you see this duality forming early. She's a regular, occasionally defiant child who simultaneously possesses a profound, almost inexplicable spiritual gravity.
She wasn't an angel. She was a human being grappling with a deep spiritual pull.
And that duality only intensifies as she enters adulthood. In 1884, at the age of 21, she marries Francisco Armida.
And over the next 15 years, between 1885 and 1899, they have 9 children.
I really want you, the listener, to pause and fully internalize the sheer physical, biological, and emotional reality of that timeline.
9 children.
In 15 years, this is late 19th century Mexico.
There are no modern appliances, no modern conveniences.
And infant mortality rates are staggeringly high. She was essentially pregnant or nursing continuously for a decade and a half.
The physical toll is immense. Understanding it is crucial to understanding her theology. Add to that the emotional labor of raising 9 distinct personalities.
Managing a large domestic staff.
Constantly facing the threat of childhood illnesses, which, as you noted, were frequently fatal in that era without antibiotics.
The central question her life poses is, how does a person maintain any sense of distinct individual identity under those crushing domestic demands?
Let alone cultivate one of the 20th century's most prolific and complex interior spiritual lives.
Because you would assume a household with 9 young children would be the absolute antithesis of a spiritual incubator.
The noise, the constant demands, the physical exhaustion.
You would think she'd be operating entirely in survival mode. But the timeline in the archives shows something extraordinary. Her profound mystical experiences didn't wait for her kids to grow up and move out.
No, they didn't. In 1894, right in the thick of raising these toddlers and infants, the records indicate she experienced what is termed spiritual nuptials.
Now, for someone not steeped in Catholic mystical theology, what exactly does that mean? It sounds intensely intimate.
It is intensely intimate. In the broader tradition of Christian mysticism, echoing figures like St. Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross,
Right.
the term spiritual nuptials refers to a definitive, transforming union between the soul and God. It's not a fleeting moment of peace during prayer. It's described as a permanent, unbreakable internal vow.
So the soul is inextricably bound to the divine.
Exactly. What is so staggering about Conchita's experience is the context. Historically, this level of mystical union is almost exclusively documented in cloistered monastics who spend decades in silent contemplation.
And Conchita experienced this profound internal milestone while she was actively managing a household of young children.
The mystical breakthrough happened concurrently with the mundane reality of motherhood.
That is just incredible. But as we move into the next phase of her life, from 1901 to 1921, the narrative takes a sharp, devastating turn.
It really does.
In 1901, tragedy strikes. Conchita is just 39 years old when her husband, Francisco, suddenly dies.
Overnight, she is left to raise these 9 children entirely on her own, the youngest being only 2 years old at the time.
We have to slow down and really consider the socioeconomic reality of a widow in 1901 Mexico. She lost her partner, her primary source of financial stability, and the father of her 9 children.
The sheer panic and grief of that moment would be enough to break almost anyone, but her personal tragedy was only the precursor to a massive national catastrophe.
Right, because less than a decade later, the macro context of her life just explodes. From 1910 to 1921, the Mexican Revolution completely ravages the country.
The statistics surrounding the Mexican Revolution are horrifying. The conflict took the lives of roughly 900,000 people.
To put that into perspective, the total population of Mexico at the time was only about 15 million.
That means a staggering 6% of the entire country was wiped out in a single decade.
Losing 6% of a nation's population, that means the violence was inescapable. Every single person in the country would have known someone who was killed, disappeared, or displaced.
We are talking about the total collapse of societal infrastructure. You had warlords and revolutionary factions forces aligned with Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, Venustiano Carranza battling for control.
The violence was indiscriminate, the economy was ruined, and the daily uncertainty of simply trying to secure food and keep a family safe was an omnipresent nightmare.
And crucially for Conchita, the revolution also brought waves of intense, violent anti-clericalism and persecution of the Catholic Church.
Which makes her internal state during this time practically miraculous. You have the ultimate recipe for complete psychological collapse.
Sudden widowhood, 9 dependent children, and a literal bloody revolution raging outside her door.
And yet, the biographical accounts in her own writings from this exact period reflect what is described as an amazing tranquility.
How is that even possible?
That is the defining paradox of her existence. To understand it, we have to look at how she compartmentalized, or rather, how she integrated her reality.
She didn't achieve tranquility by ignoring the war or the difficulty of her life. Her writings are incredibly honest about her suffering.
But her internal state was so deeply anchored by that earlier mystical union, those spiritual nuptials we discussed, that the external chaos could not breach her core.
She achieved a state of detachment where her peace was not contingent on her circumstances. I want you to just think about your own modern anxieties. Information overload, work stress, and then compare it to the literal life and death chaos she lived through.
That is a staggering level of spiritual discipline. And it brings us to the core of her legacy, the divine mission she felt called to, and those 60,000 pages of theology she produced.
In her writings, Conchita documented a specific, intense internal directive she believed she received from God.
She wrote that she was told, "Ask me for a long-suffering life and to write a lot. That's your mission on earth."
I have to push back on this a bit, because to a modern ear, praying for a long-suffering life sounds masochistic, almost self-destructive.
It really does. How does this fit into a healthy theology rather than just pure psychological self-harm?
That is a vital question. Out of context, it absolutely sounds masochistic. But within the framework of her specific mystical theology, this calling is rooted in the concept of redemptive suffering.
Okay, unpack that.
It traces back to the Pauline epistles, specifically the idea of making up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. In this view, suffering isn't sought out because pain itself is good. Pain is inherently bad.
Right.
But when suffering is inevitable, as it was for a widow in a war zone, it can be spiritually united to the suffering of Christ on the cross for the redemption of the world.
So by asking for a long-suffering life, she was offering her inevitable pain as a spiritual sacrifice for the renewal of the church and society.
Exactly. And the directive to write a lot alongside that suffering indicates that her navigation of this pain was meant to be an instructional manual for others.
That makes a lot more sense. It's about finding utility and meaning in the suffering, rather than just being crushed by it. And I think it's important to clarify the nature of her mystical experiences based on the source.
Her biographers note that she never claimed to have direct physical visions of Jesus or Mary standing in her room.
Instead, she experienced deep internal communications through silent prayer and meditation.
Yes, and that distinction grounds her mysticism in a reality that is far more accessible while still being extraordinarily profound. It wasn't about flashy supernatural phenomena or hallucinatory visions.
It was about the absolute depths of internal contemplation.
We get a brilliant glimpse into the intensity of this internal life from a diary entry she wrote in 1896. She states, "In truth, after I touched God and had an imperfect notion of his being, I wanted to prostrate myself, my forehead and my heart in the dust and never get up again."
My forehead and my heart in the dust and never get up again. The sheer humility in that statement is striking.
It perfectly articulates the overwhelming nature of the divine. Notice her precision. She says she had an imperfect notion of his being.
Even in her highest mystical states, she retains the theological sobriety to recognize that a finite human mind cannot fully comprehend the infinite God.
But even that tiny, imperfect glimpse of the divine is enough to completely annihilate human ego.
When a person's interior life is anchored in that kind of awe, the day-to-day anxieties of the external world, even the terrifying realities of the Mexican Revolution, are placed into a radically different eternal perspective.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the sheer volume of her output. Let's really dig into the logistics of these 60,000 handwritten pages.
One of the most mind-bending details in her historical record comes from her own children. They reported that growing up, they hardly ever saw her in the process of writing.
How is that physically possible?
It is an astonishing logistical puzzle. Let's break down the math and the physical reality of her era. She lived to be 74 years old. To produce 60,000 pages of coherent, complex theological reflection means she was writing multiple pages every single day of her adult life.
And doing it by hand with an inkwell and a pen, likely by the dim light of a candle or a rudimentary lamp.
To do it so quietly and consistently that her 9 children rarely noticed implies an almost superhuman level of discipline.
She must have been staying up late into the night after the house finally went to sleep.
Or waking up hours before dawn, before the daily chores began. The sheer physical exhaustion of that, on top of the emotional exhaustion of widowhood and war, is unfathomable.
And it speaks to a very specific kind of hidden devotion. She wasn't writing these pages to publish bestsellers or to become a famous intellectual or to go on speaking tours.
She was fulfilling that private internal directive, write a lot. It was an intimate dialogue between her and the divine.
And the content of that dialogue was incredibly robust. This brings us to her literary legacy. She wasn't just keeping a diary of her feelings, she was developing what we might call a theology for the real world.
A major overarching theme across her texts was teaching her readers how to genuinely love the Catholic Church. But she provided a very rigorous, challenging definition of what that love actually entails.
Yes, her writings provide a direct quote on this topic that feels incredibly relevant even today. She wrote that to love the church is not to criticize her, not to destroy her, not to try to change her essential structures.
And not to reduce her to humanism, horizontalism, and to the simple service of a human liberation.
Instead, she argued that true love for the church means cooperating with the work of redemption by the cross and obtaining the grace of the Holy Spirit to renew the earth.
What exactly does she mean by horizontalism here?
Horizontalism is a crucial theological concept to unpack. In Christian theology, the cross has 2 beams, the vertical and the horizontal. The vertical beam represents the relationship between humanity and God, the divine transcendent connection. The horizontal beam represents the relationship between human beings, social justice, charity, and earthly liberation.
During times of massive social upheaval, like the Mexican Revolution, there was a strong temptation for religion to become purely horizontal.
Exactly. The focus shifts entirely to social work, political liberation, and humanism, while the vertical relationship with God is neglected or treated as secondary.
Conchita was fiercely pushing back against that. So she's saying that while the social and human elements are important, you absolutely cannot reduce the church to just a non-governmental organization or a social services agency.
If you cut off the vertical connection to God, the horizontal work eventually burns out or loses its transcendent meaning.
The core must always remain that vertical cooperation with divine redemption, which then, as a byproduct, flows outward to renew the earth.
She articulated this massive vision across dozens of specific works. One of her most notable texts is Seasons of the Soul. In this book, she outlines spiritual maturation as a slow, organic process.
She describes how the Holy Spirit gradually transforms the human soul through various seasons, winters of desolation, springs of renewal, until the soul is molded into the image of Jesus.
I appreciate that framework so much because it acknowledges that spiritual growth isn't a neat, linear progression. There are periods of dormancy and darkness that are just as necessary as the periods of vibrant growth.
But the text that I find the most fascinating and the one that truly cements her uniqueness is a collection called A Mother's Letters.
It is a remarkable collection because it serves as the ultimate bridge between her towering mysticism and her gritty, everyday reality.
Right. If you only read her heavy theological treatises on the Holy Spirit, you might forget who is holding the pen. But A Mother's Letters shows her warm, intensely human side.
She is writing to her children, giving them practical advice, dealing with family drama, and navigating the complexities of their lives.
It proves definitively that you don't have to cease being a warm, engaged, deeply attached parent in order to achieve profound holiness.
In fact, her motherhood was the very crucible in which her holiness was forged.
Another crucial dimension of her theology is found in a work titled I Am, Eucharistic Meditations on the Gospel, which she wrote in 1912.
Right in the heart of the revolution, it's important to explain the context of how this was written. The text notes these 31 meditations were born out of Eucharistic adoration.
For those unfamiliar, Eucharistic adoration is a Catholic practice where the consecrated host, which Catholics believe is the real presence of Jesus Christ, is placed in a gold vessel called a monstrance on the altar.
And the believer simply sits in silence in front of it, adoring and meditating.
And what she did during those silent hours is fascinating. She focused specifically on the passages in the Gospel where Jesus defines himself using the words, I am.
Statements like, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, or I am the good shepherd.
She used that silent, contemplative time to drill down into the absolute core identity of Christ. And it's astonishing to think she was doing this in 1912.
The streets outside the church were literally war zones.
And she is inside, in total silence, unpacking the metaphysical reality of the Gospels. Her focus was absolute.
And her output wasn't limited to just a few texts. Her biographers detail a vast library of specific works.
Just a lightning round of titles here. She wrote, To my priest, holy hours, before the altar, you belong to the church, and irresistibly drawn to the Eucharist.
I want to pause on that first title, To My Priests. It is incredibly striking that a widowed laywoman is writing a spiritual manual directed at ordained priests.
Especially during the Mexican Revolution, priests were being actively hunted, exiled, and executed. The church hierarchy was under literal assault.
And here is a mother stepping into the breach, writing theological guidance to support and fortify the priesthood.
It shows the immense spiritual authority she wielded, an authority born entirely out of her interior life, not out of any official ecclesiastical office.
And this transitions us perfectly into the next major phase of her life. Conchita wasn't just a thinker, a writer, or a mystic. She was a prolific institution builder.
She took all of this internal theology and moved it directly into external action by founding a movement known as the Works of the Cross.
The timeline of the institutions she built is just mind-blowing. Again, she's doing this as a mother and later as a widow amidst national chaos.
The historical records show she founded 5 distinct religious organizations. She starts in 1895 with the Apostleship of the Cross,
which was aimed at lay people, inviting them into the spirituality of redemptive suffering.
Then 2 years later, in 1897, she founds a religious order for women, the Congregation of the Sisters of the Cross, the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Notice the timeline. The Sisters of the Cross are founded in 1897. Then there is a significant 12-year gap before her next foundation. What happens in that gap?
Her husband dies in 1901.
She is thrust into the sheer survival mode of single motherhood and grief. But she eventually regains her footing, and in 1909, she founds the Covenant of Love with the Heart of Jesus, another initiative for lay people.
And as the revolution kicks into high gear, she focuses on the clergy. In 1912, she establishes the Fraternity of Christ, the priest.
As we discussed, this was a moment when priests in Mexico were in desperate need of spiritual and fraternal support due to the intense persecution they were facing.
Finally, in 1914, she co-founds the Congregation of the Missionaries of the Holy Spirit, a religious order for priests and brothers.
5 completely distinct organizations. She built an entire spiritual infrastructure that survived the revolution and continues to operate globally to this day.
And what is vital to understand about these foundations and her 60,000 pages of writing is how the official church hierarchy responded to them.
Historically, when an uncloistered layperson claims to receive divine directives, writes thousands of pages of new theological reflections, and starts founding religious orders, the institutional Catholic Church reacts with extreme skepticism and caution.
The potential for heresy or schism is incredibly high.
But that wasn't Conchita's story at all. The archives note that her writings were rigorously examined by church officials in Mexico during her lifetime, and they found nothing contrary to the faith.
More impressively, in 1913, she actually traveled to Rome and had a private audience with Pope Pius X.
Let's just think about the logistics of that for a second. It's 1913. There is a bloody revolution in her home country. She is a 50-year-old widow.
She travels by train and steamship across the world to the Vatican, and the result of that meeting. The church authorities looked favorably upon her writings and her works of the cross.
Receiving favorable recognition from the Pope in 1913 is a massive, definitive validation of her orthodoxy and the profound depth of her work.
It confirmed that she wasn't a rogue visionary leading a splinter cult. She was a genuine, enriching voice within the heart of the church. She had successfully navigated the intense scrutiny of the Vatican.
Which brings us to the culmination of her extraordinary life and the long, rigorous path to her official recognition.
The historical records state that Conchita passed away on March 3, 1937, at the age of 74. She was buried at the Church of San Jose del Altillo in Mexico City.
But looking back on her legacy, there is a specific quote she wrote that I think perfectly synthesizes everything we've analyzed today.
Let's hear it.
She wrote, "I carry within me 3 lives, all very strong. Family life with its multiple sorrows of 1,000 kinds, that is, the life of a mother, the life of the works of the cross with all its sorrows and weight, which at times crushes me until I have no strength left, and the life of the spirit or interior life, which is the heaviest of all, with its highs and lows, its tempests and struggles, its light and darkness. Blessed be God for everything."
That quote is a masterpiece of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Let's dissect the 3 lives she identifies because it strips away any romanticized notions of her existence.
First, she names the family life the life of a mother. She explicitly highlights its multiple sorrows of 1,000 kinds.
She doesn't sugarcoat motherhood. She acknowledges the crushing grief of widowhood, the constant low-level hum of anxiety over her children's safety, and the physical exhaustion of her reality.
Then she names the second life, the works of the cross, and again she says it at times crushes me until I have no strength left.
Founding 5 religious orders isn't a hobby. It requires immense administrative labor, dealing with interpersonal conflicts, managing finances, and carrying the spiritual responsibility for thousands of followers.
But the true revelation in this quote is how she describes the third life. She explicitly calls the life of the spirit, the interior life, the heaviest of all.
Heavier than the grief of widowhood. Heavier than raising 9 kids. Heavier than navigating a revolution or managing 5 institutions. Why?
Because true mystical depth is not a vacation from reality. It is a fierce, exhausting battleground.
I think that is such a profound point. We often treat the interior life or spirituality as an escape hatch. We think of it as a quiet, peaceful room we retreat into when the real world gets too loud.
But Conchita describes it as having tempests and struggles, its light and darkness.
Exactly. In the tradition of Christian mysticism, the deepest interior journeys involve confronting your own darkest flaws, wrestling with the incomprehensible vastness of God, and enduring what is known as the dark night of the soul.
This is a period of intense spiritual desolation where God feels entirely absent and the soul is stripped of all emotional consolations.
Navigating that internal tempest while maintaining outward peace requires a phenomenal expenditure of spiritual and psychological energy. Yet she ends the quote with, "Blessed be God for everything." She wholly embraces the crushing weight of all three lives.
It is that exact lived reality, this integration of towering holiness amidst gritty, agonizing human struggle, that eventually catalyzed the Church to officially recognize her.
The timeline of her canonization process is fascinating because it illustrates just how meticulous and judicial the Catholic Church is about these claims. The process didn't happen overnight. It officially opened in 1959.
Yes, 22 years after her death. And the opening of the process involved the Archbishop of Mexico City submitting about 200 volumes of her translated writings to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome.
200 volumes. I cannot even fathom the bureaucratic and theological undertaking required to review that.
You have Vatican theologians, historians, and linguistic experts who have to read every single line of those 60,000 pages to ensure there is not a single theological error, heresy, or psychological delusion hidden in the text.
No wonder the process took decades.
It is a massive judicial trial of a person's life and thought, documented in a massive file known as the Positio. But she passed that intense scrutiny. On December 20th, 1999, Pope John Paul II officially declared her venerable.
Let's define what that actually means, because venerable isn't just an honorary adjective. What does that title signify in the canonization process?
To be declared venerable means that the Pope, after reviewing the massive findings of the theological and historical commissions, formally decrees that the individual lived a life of heroic virtue.
It is the Church's official confirmation that her faith, hope, charity, and fortitude went far beyond the ordinary human capacity and entered the realm of the heroic. It is a monumental milestone.
From there, the process requires divine confirmation in the form of a scientifically inexplicable miracle attributed to her intercession.
And the records show that on June 8, 2018, Pope Francis officially confirmed such a miracle. This cleared the final hurdle.
On May 4, 2019, an incredibly historic event took place. Conchita was formally beatified, declared blessed, in a massive ceremony at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, presided over by Cardinal Giovanni Angelo Becciu.
The historical and cultural significance of that beatification is profound. With that decree, Conchita became the very first Mexican laywoman to be raised to the altars.
She wasn't a martyred nun or a cloistered abbess. She was a wife, mother of 9, and a widow who lived in the bustling streets of San Luis Potosi in Mexico City.
So after analyzing the 60,000 pages, the historical backdrop of the revolution, the 5 foundations, and the deep mystical theology, how do we synthesize this? If you are listening to this deep dive, what is the ultimate takeaway from the life of Conchita?
I believe the central thesis her life offers is the complete destruction of our modern excuses regarding the spiritual life.
Explain that.
We constantly tell ourselves that we need ideal conditions to cultivate our interior lives. We say we will meditate more, pray more, or think more deeply once the kids are older, once work slows down, or once the world stops being so chaotic.
Conchita's life vehemently rejects that premise. She proves that extreme external demands do not preclude a rich interior life. In fact, the mundane, chaotic reality of daily life is the exact environment where profound holiness is forged.
You can be fleeing a literal revolution or mourning a spouse or wrangling toddlers and still be constructing an internal cathedral of immense theological depth.
That is perfectly stated. The chaos isn't the obstacle to the interior life. It is the raw material for it.
Beautifully said.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Building purely off the astonishing reality of those 60,000 handwritten pages. We discussed how her own children, living in the same house with her, barely ever saw her writing.
Right.
She produced a theological library rivaling Thomas Aquinas entirely in secret, right under their noses. It forces you to look at the world differently. Tomorrow, as you go about your routine, as you look at the seemingly ordinary people around you, the exhausted parent at the grocery store, the quiet coworker, the person sitting next to you in traffic, it makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what invisible, massive, profoundly complex interior worlds might they be building right in front of you, completely unseen? Conchita's story reminds us that you never truly know the depth of the soul standing right beside you.
A deeply humbling and powerful perspective to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary hidden life of Blessed Concepción Cabrera de Armida. We appreciate you taking the time to explore this fascinating history with us. Until next time.